Hey everybody, I hope you're doing well today. Well, let's take a look at the third trade strategy for economic growth and economic development, which is trade liberalization, which basically means what it maybe sounds like to you. It's the removal or at least the reduction of trade barriers that block the free trade of goods and services between countries. And of course, what does that mean? It means the elimination of such things as tariff barriers, quotas, export subsidies, and administrative legislation. So it does all those things that pushes countries towards free trade and away from barriers, right? Away from protectionism. So let's take a look at them more specifically. The key idea, I just threw it out here, is removal or at least reduction of barriers. And there should be another quote there, right? The elimination of barriers, quotas, export subsidies, administrative legislation. And so the basic idea is that it's the belief that trade liberalization will increase world trade and will enable developing countries to concentrate on the production of goods and services in which they have a comparative advantage. And that sounds really nice and sweet. And it is. And that's the way the world should work. If you had Adam Smith in charge, that's what he'd want. And because you know what? It is what is best. Everybody who has the comparative advantage in a particular product should be the one that's in charge of making it. And if not, if you're not good at something, then don't. Let someone else do it. That's the whole idea of comparative advantage. Well, the World Trade Organization is the institution that in any way attempts to promote trade liberalization and so to encourage free trade. And you can check out the video on the World Trade Organization, exactly what they do, or just whatever, look on the website somewhere, right? But the main institutions that try to push towards free trade and liberalization is the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the U.S. Treasury Department. They have all adopted these ideas, and it's become known as something called the Washington Consensus because the world headquarters for these three institutions and the power of them resides in Washington, D.C. So one thing that's kind of interesting, and if you live in Latin America, as I have for half of my adult life, these Latin American countries have been encouraged to adopt these market-based policies. And it's not that they're trying to push, the developed nations are trying to push countries towards doing something that's not in their own best interest. It's definitely in their own best interest. The thing is it in their own best interest in the short run or in the long run? And countries like Venezuela, Bolivia, Brazil, they've been pushed towards these liberalization trade policies, which in effect are good, but in the short run, they tend to benefit the developed nations more so than the developing nations because they're very much a supply side market-based policy. So what are they? Well, fiscal discipline, balanced budgets. Latin American countries seeking help were encouraged to do such things. Redirect spending priorities to basic health and education, to lower marginal tax rates and broaden the tax base. Interest rate liberalization, a competitive exchange rate, trade liberalization, liberalization of foreign direct investment inflows, the push towards privatization, deregulation, and secure property rights. Don't ever underestimate, by the way, the secure property rights as a key element of economic growth and therefore economic development. And the reason for that is that institutions, or not institutions, foreign direct investors are not interested in losing their money. And in the thick of it, they really just care about getting a return. And I had an example of this, and I think I spoke about this in a different video. But I was living in Nicaragua, and there was Marriott Hotels had committed $60 million to build a resort in Nicaragua, right on the coast. Absolutely beautiful place. I've been there a ton. And then Daniel Ortega took over as president, and Daniel Ortega was the president. He was freely elected. He was the president during the 1980s who ran the socialist government the United States didn't like, and he nationalized a bunch of property. Now, he's not a socialist really anymore. He's just kind of a power monger. But the Marriott hotels, chowcito. They took their $60 million and went down the Pacific coast of Central America, another 100 miles, and they invested it in a resort in Costa Rica. Why? Because Daniel Ortega had actually participated in taking away the rights, the property, of institutions, or of anybody, Nicaraguan citizens, and certainly any sort of foreign direct investment. So these things are big, and this is what they mean. And really, if you just look at them, they are market-based supply-side policies. And you've seen these before. And of course, Washington, or the Washington Consensus, the international organizations of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, are going to encourage these things because this does create growth. It's not fake. It really does. It's just that it can prove to be really difficult for developing nations because they're not really in a position to compete in the same way that they might want to with the bigger countries. And so one of the pushbacks of the Washington Consensus is that they feel like feel like the anti-globalization movement is what it is. They feel like that the Washington Consensus principles, these principles right here, are just a way of giving access to cheap labor to multinational corporations. And if they do that, if they allow multinational corporations to come in with the cheap labor and take care of high prices and then take those products and create inexpensive products and then sell them to developed nations at a high price, well, then who is that really helping? It's not necessarily helping the developing nation. No, it's creating high profits and in the developed world. And of course, that does come back to help the developing world, but it can seem to be somewhat of a way of taking advantage of the cheap labor. And the thing is that in many ways, it hasn't necessarily, free trade and trade liberalization hasn't necessarily led to high economic growth. Instead, we have seen instances of, crises, right? Economic crises, increased debt for developing nations, and increased inequality. And there's actually been a pretty direct response to these Washington Consensus trade liberalization policies, and it's created not left ward, that should say left wing leading movements in Latin America. Venezuela is a great example with Hugo Chavez, and it continues to this day. Bolivia, same thing. Brazil, same thing. And of course, Cuba has been that way all along. Argentina, in the last few years, has moved back maybe to an import substitution approach, but there's still an impact politically of leaning to the left, which tends to favor protectionism. It tends to favor the working class. It tends to favor policies that are not supportive of supply side or market-based policies. Okay, so, trade liberalization sounds great, and it is, economically speaking, an effective way of expanding growth and then, therefore, secondarily, the development of developing nations. Okay, so take all that, hold it in your head. Just more information, right? You're building a knowledge base. You're building a knowledge base of things that you need to know about international trade and how it leads to economic development. All right, I hope you thought that was helpful. We'll talk to you in a bit.